I haven't got a PowerPoint, so my words will have to do the pictures as well as as well as the descriptions themselves. Fred, of course, emphasised Corbusier, and absolutely, we wouldn't be here without Corbusier. The modern world wouldn't exist without him. His influence on the 20th century in architecture is absolutely without parallel. Although I have to say, Mies van der Rohe is pretty good as well. But here, we see a particular thing. Here in Golden Lane, we see a particular thing, which is a British version of Corbusier. And I sort of think that's very different. And it's partly getting it wrong. And I think that's partly, that's kind of come across in a lot of things that Fred said. It's kind of mistranslated. I mean, significantly, the great book that he did in the 1920s, before the Real Radiators, was Towards an Architecture. What was it in English? Towards a New Architecture. Completely shifted the meaning, and of the words inside, which are translated by Frederick Etchells, lots of liberties, lots of Englishism crept into this rigorous continental thinking. So I think we can say the same about the architecture, but it doesn't mean to say it's bad. I think it's a better for it, really, that it's less pure, it's more hybrid. And in particular, there's a particular thing I would say, for me, I see when I walk around Golden Lane, and that is the influence of Patrick Abercrombie. Abercrombie wrote this official report about the reconstruction of London in 1943, while, of course, the bombs were dropping all around. And what he said was, what we need is communities. And the whole of London, I'm slightly parodying here, the whole of London was going to be divided into communities of about 6,000 people. There's probably not as many as 6,000 people in Golden Lane, but sort of, this is the right kind of scale. And the idea was, we don't like cities to be big, we want lots of communities where people will know each other, where people relate to each other, where the kids can go to school, and of course there is one just to the north of the estate. Kids will go to school without having to cross a road. That was all coming from Patrick Abercrombie and his plan. And Patrick Abercrombie's... all right. I'll talk louder. Patrick Abercrombie's ideas in turn came from various influences, certainly including Le Corbusier. But there's two I'd like to mention that didn't really come up in Fred's account. There's someone called Tonius, who's he's a German social theorist, and he evolved this theory about community. Again, it's a sort of anti-urban thing, we don't really want to live in these big anonymous cities, we want to live in communities. And Tonius' thinking had a big influence, not only on Abercrombie, but a whole lot of people who came after him. There's also another thing. This is slightly bizarre, but someone called Alka Tripp, who was a commissioner of police at Scotland Yard, wrote in the 1940s a book about how to rebuild cities. And he evolved the idea of a precinct. He was inspired by things like the Inns of Court and various other kind of English, maybe even the English Garden Square in a way. And what that was kind of saying was, again, it's a sort of anti-urban thing. We want to be in a community, inward-looking rather than relating to the city as a whole. So I would say that both of those things we can see here in the Golden Lane estate. And obviously for those of you who live here, it does seem to work. It does seem to be a community. Whenever I go to Fred and Buffy's house, there's always people knocking on the door asking for cups of sugar. And, it really seems to work as a community. Now, the other thing I wanted to say, well, a couple of other things I wanted to say. I will try to be brief. Nobody's mentioned the name of Alison and Peter Smithson yet. Now, if you study architectural history of the 20th century, you'll almost certainly come across the project that they did in 1952 for the building of the Golden Lane estate. And the kind of, I suppose, the received wisdom is, why wasn't it built? It should have been built. I don't actually live here, but I'm very glad it wasn't built. I think, what Chamberlain, Powell and Bond did was a far more successful piece of city, a far more successful place to live. They evolved the idea of the streets in the air, which of course they later came to build in Robin Hood Gardens in the East End. But here, this was the first trial of the scheme. But there is one interesting thing that they did, I think, which there's a famous perspective of their scheme, and it's surrounded by bombed-out basements, and sort of it's built into the grain of the site. This was, of course, completely bombed. It was built, on a bombed site, of course. And what they wanted to do was, instead of doing a Corbusian wiping it out and starting again, it was, let's incorporate the grain of what's there, the rubble walls and what have you, which are here. And that's a sort of interesting thing, which I think we can now appreciate more than perhaps people did at the time. Gordon Cullen, I completely agree with Fred. As you walk around the estate, you see a lot of Gordon Cullen. Gordon Cullen's idea of a kind of picturesque townscape was very, very influential. But he, in turn, I think, picked it up from a whole group of people who were also associated with the Architectural Review. And this idea of a very English, softer modernism you see probably at best in the work of Gordon Cullen. I looked at some issues of the Architectural Review actually last night, not tonight, before I was coming here, as it were. And in the 1952 AR, there are two articles by Gordon Cullen. One is on surface, and the other is on shared space, which, as Fred has been showing with the examples of Gordon Cullen, are very much about working with the texture and the material, the kind of sense of making meaningful places. And I'm not saying Chamberlain, Powell and Bond did anything as obvious as read those articles and apply it, but the surfaces you get here, all these hard surfaces, not much planting, a lot of hard surfaces you really see in a lot of Cullen's work. And of course the shared space, a sense of making places, meaningful places for people to mix or to pass through, also of course comes from Gordon Cullen. So I'm very envious of you who live in Golden Lane, as you do. It must be a fantastic place to live. And of course, one of the things which is perhaps implicit in what Fred was saying as well is this place works. How many of the post-war housing estates that were built all over London, all over the rest of Britain, how many of them work? Some of them do, but this one does more than most. So that's it. Thank you.